Good evening, everyone. My name is Gerald Gunderson. I'm the supervisory archivist here at the Gerald Ford Presidential Library, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Thank you for your commitment to the Ford Library and Museum and for braving the elements in person this evening. We greatly appreciate that. And thank you too to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for its continued support. Before we begin, please silence or turn off all cell phones. And during the Q&A session following our speaker's presentation, please use the microphone at the back of the auditorium to ask your questions. I should also mention some of our upcoming programs here and at the Ford Museum. Every Tuesday through February and March, the Ford Museum will be hosting the West Michigan World Affairs Council's Great Decision series of lectures. And on February 19th, Megan Gorman will be here at the Ford Library to discuss her book, All the President's Money. She will also be at the Ford Museum the following day on February 20th. To learn more about all upcoming events, please visit our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now I have the honor of introducing our speaker this evening, Dr. Henry Luttikhuizen. Late last summer, as it turned out, Dr. Luttikhuizen reached out to the Ford Library Museum about doing an exhibit on political cartoonist Pat Oliphant. As it turned out, he had perfect timing, as our curator, Dr. Gerald Ford, was in the process of finishing her planning for an Oliphant exhibit that is currently on display in our lobby here at the library. So it seemed only fair that we would then ask Dr. Luttikhuizen to present a program on Pat Oliphant. So here we are. Henry Luttikhuizen is Professor Emeritus of Art History at Calvin University and Scholar in Residence at Grand Valley State University. He earned his PhD at the University of Virginia and is a specialist in 15th century Dutch and Flemish art. He has served as president of the Midwest Art History Society and as president of the American Association of Netherlandic Studies, and is a Smithsonian Journeys expert. Dr. Luttikhuizen spoke at the Ford Museum a few years ago during an exhibition on the Sistine Chapel, so I know we are in for a treat tonight as he explores the art of Pat Oliphant. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry Luttikhuizen to the Ford Library stage.
It's always good you clap at the beginning. Well, first of all, I want to voice also my thank you to all of you for showing up this evening. And it truly is an honor to speak at the Ford Library. It's nice to come to the east side of the mitten for once. So tonight, what I've been planning on doing, of course, is talking about political or editorial cartoons. And it may seem like a simple task, but it's actually quite difficult. Okay? It poses great challenges because in a way what I have to do is explain jokes. And I can't imagine anything worse as a speaker than to try to tell you why something is funny. It just seems like it would be the most dry, worst sermonette you can imagine. So I've decided not to do that tonight because I like you already. And so instead what I'm going to do is try to focus on how do political cartoons work? Where do they come from? And why are they important to a democratic society? Pat Oliphant, and okay. I don't know if this is going to work or not, John. We've had gremlins all day, so we'll see if the slides work. Oliphant's images of Ford will be the subject of this talk, as well as what we have out there in the exhibition. And once in a while, cartoons make the news. We're going to need a little help. As they say, Houston, we have a problem. Okay. Every once in a while, cartoons are in the news. You know, whether we're, back. Perfect, okay. Every once in a while, they're in the news. You know about the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo in France, where, of course, the terrorist attacked. Okay, well, That's one kind of storyline where we get the cartoons in the news. And more recently, although very different, we get Ann Telna's resignation from the Washington Post because they refused to show her cartoon. And for those of you that are not aware of the situation, what it had to do with is, frankly, Jeff Bezos, who you see in the your lower left, basically kneeling down before Trump. And they claim that the reason they killed the cartoon was because this is old news. It's nothing to see here. And the cartoonist was, "Don't kid a kidder, I'm out the door." Okay, so that's one of the issues at hand. And I think that's another kind of thing that perhaps we may want to talk about at the end today. Okay. Now, making political cartoons is tricky business. First, you have to hunt. You have to find something worth communicating. And you don't have much time to pull this off. Now, Oliphant made over 10,000 cartoons. He would make roughly 5 a week. So that's something I think we have to think about, is this rapid fire and the great imagination that someone would have to have in order to make that occur. Okay, so that's tough enough. Now comes the second part. You have to be consistent. You can't just be a one-liner. If you're going to do 10,000 cartoons, it must be because something worked, okay, and that it continues to work. And so people want to continue to see your cartoons. Otherwise, of course, he would be let go. So I want you to bear that in mind, that there's a difficulty in repeatedly catching an audience's attention. His tenure lasted over 7 presidencies. That's why I brought this in. Okay, he was drawing cartoons related basically to all these, with the exception of Nixon. All right, so he continued all the way through. And even with Nixon, he probably did a few little cartoons on the side when he was still in Australia, but that's another story. Okay, then we got another issue here. So we've got the longevity question. You got to do this over and over again. You got to be quick, but then also it's a job. You're working for a newspaper, and the newspaper's hiring you because they anticipate you're going to help sales. Okay, this is not just someone making a work of art for the pleasure of making a work of art. Okay? There's a part of salesmanship that's involved here as well. It's expected that he helps to increase subscriptions and getting people to buy newspapers, okay? So in terms of sales. And so he's got to have a certain degree of savvy with that as well. So let's kind of bear those kinds of issues in mind as we're looking at these works. Editorial cartoons typically address politics in terms of comedy, and he's no exception here. But the question is, of course, where did this all begin? Well, political satire is probably about the oldest business you have in civilization, all right? It's not the oldest profession, I realize that, okay? But nonetheless, it's got to be right up there, because I can't really imagine a time, and I'm a historian, where people didn't spend hours criticizing authorities, complaining about the status quo, joking about their situation, and so forth. It seems to be something really deeply tied to our humanity. It's a sense that things aren't always right, and they can't be right. And there's got to be something we can do, or some kind of change, and kind of laughing about that and trying to cope with it. It's like the old Yogi Berra statement. If the world was perfect, it wouldn't be. Right? I mean, it's that you gotta somehow feel this push or this urge to change, and sometimes comedy is part of that. Well, it seems natural, and yet it's deeply cultural. Humor is something that it's going to make sense to us in a particular context. If I showed you examples of 18th century political cartoons ad nauseum tonight, it would be like explaining jokes, because we don't get the context. And it makes it much more difficult to appreciate what's occurring in the image. The other side of this, to help us think about humor, is that in Western civilization, it has a mixed history. In the late Middle Ages, some people thought of humor as being negative because it distorts your face and it kind of violates the goodness of God's creation, to put it in Christian terms. Sometimes they would say things like this, that when we laugh, we look like apes, or we look like dogs, that there's something bestial about laughing. And if you're not quite catching this, in the New Testament it says Jesus wept. Never said he laughed. Okay? You have that side of things. And then on the flip side, we have, well, wait a minute. Maybe humor's a good thing. Maybe it's the best medicine we have. And this is especially true of scholars and theologians that were familiar with Aristotle's writings. And they saw humor as something which could alleviate stress, something that was cathartic. It was a moment where we could ease tensions. And so in that regard, they thought of it as being positive, and they would counteract the idea of humor being negative by saying things like this: dogs and monkeys don't laugh. Now, I don't know if they do or don't. I'm not going to try to make those kinds of arguments with you tonight, but these are earlier questions. Is laughter something deeply human, or is it something that can't be trusted? And even when people took this position that, no, humor's a good thing, there are still concerns. Audiences tend to appreciate humor more if they appreciate the person delivering the jokes. So thank you very much. I think I'll call it a night. Okay. The other thing that people don't really care for is if the barb of the joke is directed at them. Okay. They like it when you laugh at others, but at them, not so much. Okay. So that's a question too with humor. We have to be concerned with that, as well as the extremes. Is it something that's vulgar, crude, or is it just plain mean-spirited? You don't want to have either one of these questions. And this may seem like, oh, why is he talking about the late Middle Ages? I'm also talking about Oliphant, because he's got to cope with these kinds of concerns. They're still with us to a certain extent. So political humor typically follows one of two paths. You can take pleasure in the defects of others, okay? And in doing so, there's a sense of empowerment. We might feel superior. And the other way that political humor tends to work is punching down. That is to say, you find an authority figure that you think is a bit pretentious, and you lower them down a peg through the humor. Okay, that you bring them down, so to speak, to our level. And in the case of presidents, you can kind of see which route the political humorists are going to go, right? You bring them down because they're already above us. So, you know, how do you cope with that? So one of the things they're going to do to cut them down to size is call attention to their fallibility, to their perceived folly. Now, I know I'm showing you this cartoon for quite a bit here, but and I'll get off in a moment here. But I want us to, again, think of what is even a cartoon? Because that's part of this. The word cartoon comes from the term carta. And carta means letter or map. Okay, so if you think of like the Magna Carta, okay, it has to do with making something on paper. And because of that, it's going to be deeply connected to the invention of the printing press. So when we think of political cartoons, it's got to be something that's distributed to lots of people, because it's a medium that it has reproduction into it, right? So we can have original reproductions, which sounds oxymoronic, but it's because of the kind of medium that we're addressing here. And Oliphant is going to bring together two traditions. Next one. All right. The first artistic tradition he brings us is caricature. And caricature, carico, in Italian, means to exaggerate. So when you see a caricature, it's taking physical attributes and then, well, exaggerating them. Okay? And so what you're looking at here is actually one of the very first caricatures. It's by Leonardo da Vinci. And it's of an old woman who foolishly is striving to look good. Doesn't quite work out for her, in case you're not catching it here. It's a bit grotesque, to say the least, in terms of her appearance. And this image is going to become popularized. He makes the drawing. Other artists go, that kind of works. And they start making prints. And then these get distributed through centuries. And then lo and behold, we get this book, Alice in Wonderland. And they're trying to figure out how we should depict the Ugly Duchess. Voila, there we go. Okay, so there's this important tradition of caricature. Next slide. She doesn't want to leave. Okay, here we go. Now here related to all this, I thought I would also bring in a 19th century French artist, Daumier, who's also making caricatures. I didn't want you to think it was just Leonardo and his followers. And this example is showing you the King of France, Louis Philippe, so the ruling monarch, and he's representing him as a pear. And the word in French for pear also means fathead. Okay, so it's less than subtle here. And in addition, he made this image, okay, here we go, called Gargantua. And in this lithograph, you see a giant pear-headed man, so now you know who he is, okay, the king. And he's seated on a toilet, and he's gluttonously gobbling up tax money that's been gathered up from the poor. So you have this conveyor belt thing that looks like an extension of his tongue, while all this food consumption's going into him. And then meanwhile, directly below him, you have his cronies, who are taking whatever they can grab from the other end. Okay, so now what we're seeing is kind of tied caricature to something more, how should I put it, moral satire. Now, as you can imagine, the monarch was not real pleased with Daumier's work. He demanded that the stone, that's how you make the lithograph, be destroyed, and then sentence the artist to 6 months in jail. Okay, so there's a little bit of a cost to be paid for this kind of humor. Oliphant's image of President Ford is an example of caricature. Okay, with the elongated jaw, the receding hairline, the Band-Aid, right? A reference to his miscue in Vienna when he fell on the steps of an airplane in 1975. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Band-Aid thing, I'm sure most of you have seen Chevy Chase's image from Saturday Night Live, which was repeated over again. Okay, so this is a caricature, it's an exaggeration, in order to, right away you know it's Gerald Ford. Now, I've said to you there's caricature. The other side of this is moral satire. And Oliphant is going to employ that quite extensively. And you can see that in this 16th century Flemish work by Peter Bruegel the Elder. And in this engraving, what you have is big fish eats little fish. Okay, so the man in the little boat here is pointing to the boy, and it says in Latin, "Behold." And what the kid is to learn, and we are by extension, is that big fish eat little fish. That if you think about capitalism unchecked, the little guy is going to be consumed. Okay, that's going to lead to a kind of monopoly. All right, so this is a kind of imagery that Oliphant is familiar with. Now, in the 18th century, cartoonists like Thomas Rowlandson and James Gilray combined caricature with moral satire. And you can see it here. This is Gilray's 1805 image of plum pudding in danger. And what you have is the British Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, and Napoleon carving up the world. Now, more recently, we get this cartoon. This just came out a few weeks ago. Okay, so you can see another artist, this one's from England, who's playing off of that previous work, except in this time we have Trump and we got Elon Musk. Okay, so I just want you to see how artists can be very self-conscious about this tradition. Next slide. Now, in the 19th century, political cartoons are going to become much more popular in the United States. And it happens about 1860. Okay, during the election for Abe Lincoln, things are a bit contentious, and you get this interest. What I'm showing you is from a couple decades later by Thomas Nast. And Thomas Nast didn't invent these ideas, but he popularized them. And that is the notion that you associate Republicans with elephants and Democrats with donkeys. Okay? He didn't start the analogies, but you find them in his cartoons quite readily, and that's why I brought this one in. Okay? Just to give us again the idea of how cartoons have affected the way in which we understand American politics. Oliphant is Australian, as I said, by birth. He was born in 1935. His first job at a newspaper was called The News, and his boss in 1952 was Rupert Murdoch. Some of you may have heard of this guy, okay? So I think that's kind of interesting, okay? And a year later, he worked for the competition. He didn't like Murdoch. And so he moves over to work for what is called The Advertiser, a different newspaper. And in 55, he started making political or editorial cartoons for them. Now, in 1964, so about a decade later, he moved to the US and he took a position at the Denver Post. And about a year later, he contracted with a group to do national syndication of his cartoons. So, he's first doing Australia, then he goes to Colorado, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere in the States. And initially it was pushed by Los Angeles. Then, during the Ford administration, he moved to Washington, D.C., and he starts working more tightly with what was called the Washington Star. And the Washington Star, for those who aren't familiar with this, folded in 1981. And at that point, he continued to work, but did it independently and in conjunction with this syndication. And he retired in basically the 1980s. He's still alive, okay, but he's not making cartoons any longer. And I'll explain that as we go. Now, what I'm showing you in this cartoon is an early example of his imagery of Ford. And when you look at Ford, Ford still looks, well, kind of athletic here. Okay, now, by contrast, you have George Meany, who's the president of the AFL-CIO, and he's a little timid to get into the economic waters here, so to speak. He's just dipping his toe in, but of course, Ford is all the way into the water up to his chest. The other thing you're going to notice in Oliphant's cartoons is he has a tendency of putting a little figure off to the side on the margins. He calls that figure Puck. Puck was a magazine newspaper way back when in the 19th century, and so he's kind of playing off of that. You also find these little characters in Mad magazines, and I'm sure that he was cognizant of that as well. But it's basically his alter ego. So the cartoonist, whenever you have the little bubble off to the side, and you'll see that in the room next door, that's Oliphant's voice. Okay, so just kind of be prepped there. Next slide. What I'm going to bring in here are numerous images that he used to address economic concerns and policies in the mid-1970s. And it's basically to poke fun of the ineffectiveness of whip inflation now. So again, I'm kind of explaining a joke here, but when you see the man here who looks like he's been working way too long, and then you see 50 cents crossed out, dollar crossed out, $2, you get the idea of inflation right away. Right? And of course, the old buttons for whip inflation now. Next. Okay, or some of you may recall when New York asked for a bailout. The city was going bankrupt, and Ford said, no, I'm not going to bail you out, because who's going to bail out the United States if we go broke? And so Oliphant's response to that is you see this rude New Yorker with a stogie, and then you've got President Ford acting like the band leader here who's telling him to start behaving properly, and you get the rest of the joke. I don't want to continue it on there. Next one. In addition to that, he shows the lack of support from that is Ford's economic advisors. And one of the things that you start finding in Oliphant's imagery of the Ford administration is sometimes the imagery will look more ape-like. Okay, and I wonder too if that's a notion of the, how should I put it, intellectual weaknesses that the cartoonist perceived was going on with the administration. That they weren't up to the job. Okay, that they basically behaved a little bit like monkeys. Okay, or, you know, the old line, it's not my circus, not my monkeys. Well, in this case, it kind of is for Ford. So you see the elongated face here, kind of acting a little bit like Tarzan or Ape Man, okay? And then in relationship to the others with the big crocodile, you know, how long is he going to have the strength to handle this? This preoccupation with things that might seem inept, we also find in terms of international policies. In this cartoon, Henry Kissinger is playing a key role, and that's not unusual in these works. In this particular cartoon, what we have is Oliphant playing off of the old joke about how many, and then you can fill in the blank, people does it take to fill in or to replace a light bulb, right? And so, you know, even though he's playing off that joke, it's also how the light bulb is being screwed in, right? Because you look at poor Henry Kissinger here, and he's just got to spin circles in order for Ford to get it to go in. A little easier routes, but meanwhile, what you have is the Democratic Congress over there just kind of watching. They're not really offering any advice or telling what should be done to screw in the light bulb either. They're kind of ineffective in this situation. So in a way, I think Oliphant is getting after both sides in terms of the problem here. In addition to showing the do-nothing Congress and Ford's perceived ineptness, well, we can see that the artist is sure to show that Ford has taken numerous blows. So here he is resting against the ropes as Kissinger is talking about a rematch. And meanwhile, what we get is Puck, the diminutive penguin here, his alter ego, who's suggesting that maybe Ford should just stick to golf. Okay. Now, as you're looking at this, what I want you to remember is it's the same time that film came out, Rocky. Okay, so then the cartoon takes on a little bit different character than the way we might perceive it today. He also gets involved as an artist on Ford's domestic policies. This is Ford kind of weighing who to select for the Supreme Court. And when you look at the image, the cartoonist, as well as Betty, seem to be saying, it's time to pick a woman. And then you get Ford kind of contemplating this at his desk. Ultimately, Ford does not pick a woman. Okay, he picks Stevens to be the guy on I can't even think of the word, bench. Thank you. Okay, the bench. So, it's again, I want you to think about how the cartoons are there for international issues, domestic issues, so forth. Now, another one of the issues that Ford has to address is the arrival of Ronald Reagan onto the scene. And you see that in this slide. So here we have President Ford alongside his first mate, the vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, and they're scoping the political seas. But as they do so, they're blindsided by an approaching pirate, okay, Reagan, and who plans to overtake the partisanship, okay, or plans to take over the Republican Party. And again, you have the little figure of Puck, and it just says one of his major roles. Okay, so playing off the idea again of Reagan being an actor. So we find a lot of little inside jokes taking place within these works, or at least what might seem inside to us today. I'm not sure that somebody who's 25 or 30 is going to quite catch that. But for everyone in this audience, I think we pretty much have seen B movies with Reagan in them, and so it gives a different character. Now, Ford, of course, succeeded Nixon, who, I hope it's well known, had a terrible relationship with the press. And I brought in this example from Herbert Bloch, a cartoonist from the Washington Post, who went by the name of Herblock, and he makes rather biting cartoons of the president in his connection with Watergate. And I just want you to see a difference of nuance between the two artists, but also to think about the difference between what Ford's doing and the issues that Nixon has to address. So, here I am, coppers, okay, and I'm just going to show a couple of these works. I'm not a crook, but of course the knot's in his mouth, so you see I am a crook, okay, with tapes and so forth. As you can imagine, President Nixon wasn't close friends with Herbert Bloch, and the feelings were mutual, okay? He considered the cartoonist to be one of the enemies of the state, like the reporters that you're getting from the Washington Post. So there are lots of tensions going on, and all of that is basically to set things up for you. One more, just to kind of prove the point, in case you're not quite seeing it, with Nixon here mugging with the figure of justice being overtaken. So, this antagonism going back and forth, and now here walks in the difference. Okay, it's a difference in terms of what Ford's got to do, but also the way it's handled by Oliphant. So when Ford arrives on the scene as vice president, replacing Spiro Agnew in that role, Oliphant calls attention to Ford's fool errand, that he has to defend a highly unpopular president. And soon after this image, he's going to become president, you get Oliphant's response. And what we get is a dejected Nixon who's leaving the political football at the gates of the White House. And the football, of course, is also playing on Jerry Ford's background. So it's a double entendre occurring in this work. Now, once Ford took office, he had to show himself as being different than Nixon. And so he strove to give the appearance of transcendence, or transparency, I should say. Ford himself described comedy as a two-headed coin. He said either you're the perpetrator or you're the victim. Okay? And at the same time, he kind of joked about that because he knew which side of the equation he was on. And nonetheless, Ford is going to take advantage of all this because it enables him to be the antithesis of Nixon. He is less combative, less confrontational. Okay, that's the appearance that Ford wants to give. Okay, I'm going to be open to the press. I'm transparent. You can poke fun of me. We're going to dialogue back and forth. Maybe I'll poke fun of you a little bit too, and we'll be able to have this kind of give and take relationship instead of the great tension that we had with the previous presidency. So that's the way he thinks of it. So there's a certain degree of self-deprecation that's useful for him politically. But now, as a side, I don't want to reduce Ford to that. I think that he also had the capacity to laugh at himself on occasion, but I don't think he always did. I'm sure that there were times where he was just like, this is over the top. This is just too hard because it gets at the core of his being, or it's too close to home. But nonetheless, there was this much more dynamic relationship between him and the press than what we had previously. Oliphant is quick to point out that the question of Nixon's pardon is going to continue to haunt Ford and ultimately cost him the election. And this caricature, I think, really points that out. So again, you see satire and caricature intertwined here because you can't help but think Jimmy Carter when you see those big teeth and that smile, right? It's immediate. Boom. You don't need to have a label that says Carter on his forehead. And that's another important thing about Oliphant's imagery. is he has this ability to just give you a few characteristics, few exaggerations, and you know who you're seeing. And so right away you get this toothy grin and maybe this appearance of being strategically folksy in his politeness. It's just impossible to ignore. And of course, the way he's playing on the word pardon, it's kind of like, excuse me, but at the same time, we know what's going on. And probably some type of devotional book or like Bible. Okay. Now, towards the end of his presidency, Ford starts looking quite different in Oliphant's works. His jawline increasingly resembles that of an ape, implying again that his policies were not necessarily apt or that they were inept, that he's kind of less than brilliant. Now, it's kind of a strange thing because Ford may have been the most athletic of all presidents, although I'm sure that Mr. Trump would disagree with that assessment. I think that, that is something that we should acknowledge about Ford right away. I mean, there's fun to say golfing jokes and so forth, but he played at golf courses that I probably wouldn't dare play on. Okay, I mean, was quite athletic, and yet we can't help now, because of cartoons and comedy, thinking about him as being kind of clumsy, right? And that Band-Aid is something that reinforces that. So in a way, it's calling attention to the fall that he had in Vienna, but at the same time, I think what the artist is trying to communicate is kind of the clumsiness of the policies, okay, in terms of the way he understands that. Now, years later, Oliphant was invited to attend a reunion which was held for members of the Ford administration. And at the event, to the Secret Service's dismay, he went up to Gerald Ford and he painted a Band-Aid on his forehead. I mean, he drew a Band-Aid. All right, and it's kind of interesting to think about that, because after he did that, Oliphant had this to say at the event. Quote, "President Ford is a gentleman of generous humor and one heck of a good sport. I've drawn many presidents, but he's the only one I ever drew on." End quote. And, I think something to think about here is the fact that the artist had the courage to perform this deed. That implies that he had to kind of know that Ford would be okay with it. And the other thing that happened here is that Ford himself laughed. In a way, he's laughing at himself with the idea of having the Band-Aid on him, but also the willingness to kind of play ball. So there has to be this mutual trust between these two men for something like that to occur. Now, later than that, Oliphant attended a symposium held at the Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, and the symposium was devoted to humor and the Ford administration. And lots of comedians showed up, cartoonists, the Fords were there, Jerry and Betty Ford were honored guests, and one of the people who came up and he sang at the end was Tip O'Neill. And I think that's something kind of, again, interesting to think about, that they're all celebrating comedic performances together, thinking about the relationship between laughing and politics. And I just can't imagine or foresee that kind of event taking place with today's administration. It's just how things have changed. I mean, first of all, that you have Tip O'Neill there, and at the end, he's singing to Betty Ford, holding her. It just, the idea of Republicans and Democrats having that kind of relationship just doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And I point that out in part because, next slide if you will. This is a slide that came out last week, or cartoon. And, Trump is kind of a godsend for comedians, an embarrassment of riches, if you will. His showmanship and unconventional messaging makes him an easy target for cartoonists. And for cartoonists, you have to depend on the element of surprise, the unexpected, to look at things a little way or to get people, again, to notice. And the first thing that I think people notice here is the First Lady's hat, which is easily compared to that of Zorro or to Natasha in the old Bullwinkle cartoons. It's also been linked, and I think this is a little mean, but to the rooftop of Pizza Hut. And all of that may hurt her to a certain extent, because of sense of fashion and so forth, but I think it's relatively superficial or harmless. Now, by contrast, when you see the presentation of the adjacent wizard, it's a little bit more damning, as if the waving of a magic wand will take away these major problems. Now, I brought in this cartoon because I recognize that some of you may be quite pleased with the presentation of this cartoon, whereas others may feel maybe a little bit offended. Maybe you think that Ford can accomplish these things. Maybe you don't. Political cartoons are always edgy. Okay? Otherwise, they just don't work. And it's a balancing act. And yet, I'll confess, I find today to be a little bit more difficult because the line of lampooning seems to be getting more narrow. That is to say, in today's political climate, where politicians seem to be more preoccupied with serving their base, our humor tends to be more about self-empowerment than it does some kind of dialogue. Or, another way of saying it is, it seems like we're moving towards that idea of using humor to debase others instead of dealing with questions of hubris. And, I'm not advocating for cruelty or for crudeness here, but I really think that these cartoons are important in a kind of a weird, goofy way, and that these cartoons are indispensable for democracy. I was reading, and I don't always read this, but I did a couple weeks ago, the Ford Leadership Forum, and there was an essay there by a political scientist from Georgia College. He's a good first name, Henry Edmonton the third, and this is the line that caught my attention as I was reading it. He wrote, "The most dangerous people in the world are those without a sense of humor." And I thought, yeah, there's some kind of truth to that. And I think it's really important that we laugh at ourselves. Now, today, Pat Oliphant is nearly 90 years old. He's severely impaired in terms of his eyesight. He's basically blind. And Gerald Ford has been dead now for close to 2 decades, although he recently was able to resurrect a speech for Jimmy Carter's funeral. But, nonetheless, he's been gone for a while, too. And yet, I think that we'd be best served, well served, if we would follow the lead of these two gentlemen in a way, right? I mean, that there is something good about making cartoons and about humor. We don't need to employ a rhetoric of alienation, but maybe if we think of cartoons as opportunities to make light of serious problems and of ourselves, it would help us out. Or more importantly, maybe these cartoons can help us to take another look, to be more self-critical about the worlds we inhabit and our role within a democratic society. The marvelous exhibition, which is just beyond the room, gives us a chance to do just that. To obtain a glimpse of the past, I think we kind of all enjoy looking back at events in the 1970s, but at the same time, they enable us to think about the present, how we got here. But ultimately, I hope what they can do is help us imagine or envision what we can be, or maybe some kind of better future. And if you come away from anything tonight, that's kind of my sermonette, is that I think that, the cartoons are fun and games, but they're also there to educate, not just to delight. And we're really fortunate to have these things, and even more so to have them so nearby. So please take a look, enjoy them, talk to others, use them as points of dialogue, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you. Okay, I have been told to spear questions, so to speak, but you are to ask them from the back of the room. I believe there's a microphone. Yes, there is, okay? So if you have questions, by all means, here's your chance.
Thank you for coming all the way over to this side of the state from Grand Rapids. We love it. I have a question about some of the cartoonists you mentioned. One, of course, would be Thomas Nast, who tried to take on Boss Tweed and educate people who were too busy to go to a library, able to read, they didn't speak English, but you can almost understand any message by looking at a picture.
Yeah.
And then the two that really also tried to, I think, softly educate all of us would be Gary Trudeau of Doonesbury and also Charles Schultz, who has some really powerful ones that he did during World War II. It's not just, now, but he has a lot of great things that he had to say. So I think cartoonists have always been incredibly powerful. I thank you for the wonderful examples you've had tonight. But what do you think about those others? Nast, Doonesbury, and Schultz.
All right. So for an old man, it's hard for me to remember all three, but I'll try to. Okay. First one, Nast. Yes, as you put it, he brought the system, the corrupt New York machine, down in the late 19th century. Tweed wanted the man dead or tried to bribe him, and it just did not work. Nast was a very important political figure, especially because he was able to communicate to people who couldn't read, or at least couldn't read English. So, I wouldn't minimize that at all. Second one you asked me about was Trudeau. And I actually initially had Trudeau in here, but I took him out. And the reason why I did is I think that there's something radically different about doing cartoon strips than doing just a single image. And I think they both were, they complement each other, but it's not to say they work in tandem. So again, I would say that he affected the American consciousness in many ways, but I don't think it's the same kind of editorial cartooning. And then the third one, when you mentioned Schultz, the story that came to my mind as you were speaking was when, and I cannot think of the name of the character, but he added the African American kid in the cartoons. Franklin, thank you. Okay. He adds Franklin into it, and he was told by the publisher that in the American South this may pose some problems, and they wanted him to edit it out, and he refused. And I think that also speaks well of him, but also it affects the American consciousness. So, I would say all three of those figures have made important contributions. Different ways, but nonetheless, all important. Yeah, thank you.
I attended that Humor and Presidency conference because I worked here for 39 years. But one of the cartoonists, I believe it was Paul Conrad, said, they were talking about presidential elections, and they said one candidate is good for the country and the other candidate is good for the business.
Right.
And I look at this picture here that you have posted right now, and I definitely have to agree with that.
Yeah, I think that despite some of the complaining of comics, economically they're being very well served. I don't think Jon Stewart and company are really suffering. He gives them. It's kind of a strange thing. I read something from Oliphant where he said that in some ways it's surprising that people want cartoons because the politicians already can make such fools of themselves, they don't need me. All they have to do is watch the tape or the television. And I think there's a way in which that's just never going to be the case. That the media is always going to be pushing one way or the other and magnifying certain things. So I disagree with Oliphant, but I can understand why he said what he did.
With the demise of newspapers, what do you think the impact is on political cartoons, and what's the future of political cartoons?
Well, this is kind of the advantage of being an art historian, not a philosopher or a theologian. I'm not exactly sure, but I can tell you what my gut feeling is. My feeling is that with the internet, we're becoming more and more polarized. I think it's maybe I'm just old fuddy-duddy here, but I just feel like it's becoming more and more difficult to even think about humor as something that can go across party lines or ideological barriers. That we have a tendency of preaching to the choir. And I don't know if the internet's going to solve that problem. I'm very hesitant to think so. And maybe it's because I don't necessarily trust those who are pulling the levers. I think we, as citizens, we've got to become much more self-critical. Both sides of the fence. Okay, I mean, I don't want to give you the impression I'm one political direction or the other. I'm pretty much in the middle, if you want to do a scorecard. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, I got one
From Zoom.
from Zoom. Okay, okay. Do you have a favorite Oliphant cartoon? Wow, okay, I wasn't expecting this one. I guess I should have. I kind of like, if you go back, I like keep going. It's the one with the football. I don't know why. This one here just kind of strikes me about, questions of, part of it is the dejection of Nixon, but then also maybe the way the football is illuminated. Okay, well, maybe things can change. So I see kind of a hope and despair combined here that I find rather interesting. So this would be my probably one of my favorites. In terms of the exhibition, the ones that I like have to do with New York. Now maybe that's just my own, upbringing. I didn't grow up in New York, but just the kind of poking fun of the East Coast versus Midwestern ideals and so forth. But I think that the cartoons say as much about us as they say about him in terms of which are our favorites and which aren't. It's in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. So if you have other favorites, of course I'm fine with that.
Pay tribute to Joe Spiker, a cartoonist of renown, recently died.
Mm-hmm.
And my main question tonight is, do you know if any of these political cartoonists of today are using AI as a source of manufacturing? Because I would think there's nothing new under the sun as far as repetition in art that some other cartoonists could easily rip off. And do you know, again, do you think that there is an AI used by some of these cartoonists to manufacture political cartoons in these days?
Okay. The question has to do with AI, and admittedly, I do not know of any cases where political or editorial cartoonists are using AI. I have my doubts. Many draftsmen are quite skeptical of it. AI tends to do better with words than images, and so I don't foresee that happening yet. Will it happen down the road? Probably. Okay, but I don't know of any example presently. Again, good question. Yeah. Okay, well, you didn't ask the questions I thought you were going to ask, so I'm going to ask myself 2 questions. So if you will, go forward here. Keep going. All the way to the end. Hi, Jerry. Okay, keep going. Keep going. Okay. I thought one of you would ask, did he ever represent Trump? And Oliphant did. Okay, he did it in 2017. They can be kind of crude. It's a rather different way of presenting Ford than the way he does Trump. So here you find the 2 figures urinating and having this conversation. It's of course Steve Bannon. And then next one, these are the last 2 cartoons I know by the artist. Okay, playing off the Nazi stuff. So, I mean, the tone is so different than what they had. So there's been some changes with Oliphant, too. I think Oliphant's become a little bit more bitter, maybe, about the political situation. And then the last slide, I didn't want to end on that. I thought this would be kind of he was asked what his favorite editorial cartoon was. And Oliphant said this was it. And it was a cartoon that came out right after JFK was assassinated. And, it's not funny, and that's why I didn't put it with the rest of the talk. It's not so much about comedy, but again, I think it speaks about how powerful political cartoons really can be. And Oliphant's response to this image was, it should have given the cartoonist the Pulitzer Prize instead of me. This is what they should have chose. And I think that's also kind of telling in this situation. So I want to thank you tonight for listening to me ramble on. I hope it was enjoyable. I deeply appreciate you coming out on a cold night. You all have good warm hearts, and please go see the exhibition and enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. That was terrific. We have a small token of our appreciation, a Gerald Ford pen set.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you to the audience for joining us, for venturing out this evening, and for your questions. So it's my pleasure to invite you to our reception out in the lobby, and please explore our Oliphant exhibit as well. Thank you again.